When World War II began, no one knew how many soldiers would disappear without a trace. In the very first days of the war, reports came in from units that had never heard from them again after engaging the enemy. The hail of bullets, heavy artillery fire, and disorganized defenses had wiped many out of sight of the command. On the French fronts, columns of young soldiers marched toward enemy lines and never returned. Amid the smoke and fire, communication lines were severed and no reports reached back. Commanders recorded only the approximate coordinates of the last sighting. But even those coordinates were sometimes just a hint on a map that changed every day. A gust of wind, a collapsed embankment, or a fire that had cleared the path could erase the last sign of their presence. On the Eastern Front, the Siberian cold acted like an invisible enemy. The soldiers who were left behind on the retreat route were lost in the snowy silence. No screams were heard in the blizzard. Footprints were quickly buried under the snow. Sometimes only a helmet or a leather belt remained on the frozen ground. At the end of the day, the units that were counted had a few fewer men each time. Sometimes the enemy did not find the bodies. Winter and the forest swallowed them up. On the North African front, hot desert winds blew over the ash of the Bedouin. In the desert, being lost had a different meaning. A soldier who got separated from his unit would disappear from sight within a few hours. The endless plains left no footprints. The sand swallowed up every sign. At night, the stars were no guide. The sky was steady, but the earth was unforgiving. As the caravans moved, their voices were caught in the wind. There was no place to hear cries for help. In the dust of battle, the road that was known today would not exist tomorrow. The official reports of these men had the dry words, "missing in action." But behind this phrase lay a world of ambiguity. The front line was not a clear picture. The front was changing. Defense lines were falling and advancing. Villages that had been safe yesterday were today under the enemy flag. Many soldiers were last seen retreating. In the chaos, routes were confused. Soldiers who lost their wireless operators had no way back. Sometimes the trenches where men had taken refuge were only cold ashes after hours of silence. No sign of what had happened to them remained. In some areas, the forests were devouring. The thickets of trees swallowed up the path of vision. Anyone who strayed one step from the path would disappear into the shadows. The nights in the forest were darker than the sky. The moonlight did not reach the branches. The sound of footsteps was lost in the wet leaves. Sometimes there was a rustling sound, but no one knew what it was from. A friend said it might be an animal. Another said it might be an enemy. Luck was not on the side of those who went in the wrong direction. But even the enemy did not always have an answer. Sometimes they themselves did not find the bodies. In the mountainous regions of Italy, fog and heavy rains cleared the path. The peaks had a story of quiet death. A soldier who remained behind from the group would die among the snow and stones. The air was so cold that even the sound of a scream did not resonate properly. Sometimes only a trace of blood could be seen on the stones. But that trace also disappeared with the next snowfall. In night battles, situations were more complicated. Fighting in the dark blurred the line between friend and foe. A soldier who took the wrong path could disappear by dawn. Enemy fire would come from a new direction at any moment. Roads traveled with no lights were based solely on feel and experience. The slightest mistake meant getting lost. In the Belgian forest lines, the morning fog hid everything. Soldiers advanced in column after column, but an explosion would shatter the group. A moment later, no one knew who was where. In urban battles, ruined buildings were traps for getting lost. Anyone who entered a building might never come out again. Walls collapsed and roads were blocked. No one knew which alley would lead to a dead end. The rubble covered everything, even human footprints. It was impossible to clear the rubble. The enemy was still attacking. Among the smoke, the burning, and the sound of machine guns, it was difficult to make out the path. Soldiers were sometimes registered only by the name of the neighborhood they entered. That was their last image, a name on a map. On the Pacific front, there were forests where sunlight barely penetrated. The ground was swampy, and every step could be their last. Soldiers who set foot deep in the jungle could be swallowed up by disease, the enemy, or nature itself. There are reports of entire units disappearing into the trees. No one knew where they succumbed to nature. The heat was stifling, and the insects were merciless. The dark nights were mingled with the sounds of animals and the enemy. Many were last seen by the river or along a narrow path. Then silence. No body, no sign, nothing to say. Commanders wrote reports, but no answers for their families. A simple phrase was repeated: unknown location, missing soldier. On the front lines, no one had time to think about them. The war continued, and the next day, another battle would begin. The soldiers who were lost instantly became part of the darkness. And amidst the explosions and the silence that followed, only one truth remained. For many, there was no way back.
As the war intensified, many units fought in areas with no signs or landmarks. No roads were discernible, no routes that matched accurate maps. Maps were old, routes had changed, and the ground beneath the soldiers was unknown. Wireless reports were full of noise, and messages were half-hearted and vague. Soldiers would mark a corner on a map, but before they could check again, enemy artillery would pound the spot. Getting lost in such conditions was not an unusual occurrence. It was a natural consequence of the chaos. Battalions ordered to advance would sometimes encounter fierce resistance along the way and be forced to change course. These sudden changes cut off communication with support units. In the open fields of Poland, troops moved across vast plains. When soldiers were left behind, they could see only the ground without any sign or purpose. The enemy fired from afar, but they were not seen. Orientation was almost impossible amidst the noise of artillery. The only sign was the black smoke of the fire, which was dispersed by the wind. In some cases, the support columns were several kilometers behind the main unit. The path between them was full of danger, and a soldier caught between these 2 points disappeared without a trace. Many of the missing disappeared not in direct combat, but in these passing distances. In France, after the fall of a city, some units suddenly found themselves behind enemy lines. The war moved so quickly that the situation changed every hour. A soldier who was in his bunker in the morning would be trapped in enemy territory in the evening. Communication was lost, and sometimes the last reports were only a brief hint. "We are retreating, position uncertain." And then silence. In the forests of Eastern Europe, tall branches and bushes blocked every path. A column might get stuck together as it moved, but all it took was an explosion for smoke to fill the air. When the smoke cleared, the commander could see only a fraction of the force. A few men had disappeared silently, no screams, no scenes. The forest swallowed everything. Many soldiers were forced to abandon their positions under the pressure of surprise attacks. Sometimes the escape route ended in a valley from which there was no way back. At such moments, those who were caught were never seen in any subsequent reports. Sometimes, after retreating, relief forces would return to previous areas, but they would find nothing. No bodies, no serious equipment, but just scattered rocket launchers and places where the embankments had collapsed. On dark nights, only the occasional light of greenish beacons illuminated the sky. The soldiers moved carefully, but even the best could see only a few meters ahead. The ground was muddy, the bodies were prey to rain and reptiles. In such a situation, getting lost took on a new meaning. Sometimes it was better to be dead than to disappear without a trace. The embankments often changed hands dozens of times between the two sides. No one knew who had fallen there and who had managed to escape. Soldiers who found a hole to hide in under heavy fire sometimes stayed there, losing their way. When the artillery fired again, the entrances were closed. The next day, the disconnection was complete. At least a dozen people were reported to have become separated from their group in the swampy areas and never returned. The dark brown water swallowed everything. A soldier who sank too far had only a few moments to survive. Screams were inaudible amidst the explosions. Even when the fighting subsided, the area was so dangerous that no one dared to search. Some accounts mention soldiers who left their units to fetch ammunition or deliver messages and were never seen again. The routes were not safe, and the enemy would sometimes silently close the route. No sound, no shooting, just disappearance. As the war continued, commanders ordered some units to mark the route with trees, rocks, and mounds of earth. But rain, mud, and explosions erased these marks within hours. What remained was only ambiguity. In the sky, reconnaissance planes sent to find lost units sometimes did not return themselves. Dark clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and the endless expanse of the land denied them the opportunity for accurate reconnaissance. Land, air, and sea were all sometimes enemies, and from this chaos, names were formed that were never added to the list of returnees. Each name, an unfinished story in a merciless war.
On many fronts, the structure of the battle was so fluid that no one knew exactly where the front line was. Soldiers advanced in silence and fog, toward the sound of fire, but the enemy moved in the same darkness. Sometimes two units that thought they were fighting side by side were actually miles apart. In such conditions, any small mistake could separate an entire group from the mother army. In northern France, mud and rain slowed and confused infantry columns. Soldiers who went ahead as scouts were lost under artillery fire. When the fire died down, all that was left were footprints buried in the mud, their continuation uncertain. There are reports of small groups of soldiers advancing after breaking through enemy lines, but no reinforcements following them. As a result, their communication was cut off, and all they could do was keep moving, often deep into enemy territory. The silence that followed was a sign that they had disappeared. In the mountain battles of Greece and the Balkans, narrow rocky paths forced soldiers to move in long lines. An explosion, a shower of rocks and dust, could cut the line in half. A retreating group was left without a leader or guide in the mountains. The paths were cold and slippery, and any false step could lead to a fatal fall. In many cases, the bodies of these soldiers were never found. In Burma, dense jungles swallowed up any sign of a path. Allied forces moved through tall trees and stifling humidity. When something stopped the column, a gunshot, an explosion, or even a sudden attack from the trees, communication between the sections was cut off. When the movement resumed, there were often units that realized how many men had fallen behind. It was impossible to turn back to search. The jungle hid everything from view in a matter of minutes. In some battles, soldiers in the line of fire were forced to advance and retreat several times. Each time, more names were added to the list of missing. The battlefield changed rapidly. Where one army had been in control in the morning, it might be in the enemy's hands by the evening. These rapid changes meant that even if a group of soldiers had been killed or wounded, they could not be found. In the Pacific Wars, groups of infantry troops, after landing on the beach, were driven into the jungle or mountains. In some cases, the last report was simply, "We are advancing into the island." After that, nothing more. Across the battlefields, shifting lines meant that even if a wounded soldier was lying on the ground, he would be left to his own devices by a rapid retreat. Then, enemy forces would move in, collecting equipment and perhaps laying mines. When the battle ended again and the friendly forces returned, only a desolate space remained. Not a trace of wounded or dead could be seen. On the cold steppes of Russia, the blizzard and the night frost were a silent death. Soldiers who got separated from their units, even if they survived for a few hours, died in the darkness and extreme cold. The next morning, fresh snow would cover everything, leaving no trace of them. This kind of disappearance was silent and without a trace. In many conflicts, it was difficult to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos. Units that fired incorrectly destroyed groups that were later declared disappeared in reports. Due to the heavy bombardment, no evidence remained to clarify the truth. In ports, during the rapid evacuation, soldiers were sent to different ships. Some ships sank before reaching their destinations. The crew lists were incomplete, and an accurate estimate was difficult. Many names were simply lost in the waves. The war imposed its own rules on everyone. There was no guarantee of return. The battles whose boundaries were unclear took soldiers into their hearts who, years later, remained only in the form of files with the title Fateless.
On many fronts, the line of contact was so unstable that it was practically impossible to keep an accurate record of prisoners. Soldiers who survived the chaos of battle and fell into enemy hands were often not listed. No numbers, no names, no reports, only rumors circulating among units that they might be alive. In the early battles, some soldiers thought that by surrendering, they at least had a chance of survival. But the chaos of the lines and the rapid advance of the armies meant that prisoner convoys were often lost in the thick of the fighting. At times, even the enemy forces were unaware of the exact number of prisoners they had. In Eastern Europe, when small units got separated, many of them fell into the hands of local groups or unknown units. No official records of them remained. At best, only a brief note in the command report. Last seen, northern axis, after retreat. Death in captivity was also silent. In some areas, prisoners were lost en route due to cold, hunger, or gunfire. No graves, no markings, just the ground that was once again crushed under the wheels of tanks. Some witnesses reported that groups of prisoners were taken en masse to forested areas. There they were last seen. No documents, no official accounts of what happened next. Sometimes, captivity did not even mean salvation. With the lines of battle constantly shifting, the enemy would not release prisoners in order to retreat quickly. Their fate remains in the dark. In some cases, soldiers trying to escape captivity lost their way and wandered through the harsh terrain. Snow, swamps, and landmines exhausted them. Later, when the local forces retook the area, no trace of them was found. Near the Polish border, the situation was more complicated. Armies were quickly moved from one front to another, and prisoners were left behind along the way. Their names were not recorded on any lists. Today, only a few black and white photographs of long lines of prisoners survive, showing anonymous faces. In some areas, independent militia groups or informal units took prisoners without going through military procedures. This meant that their fate was never officially recorded. Some were remembered only by a half-readable letter in the notebooks of other soldiers. The summers, the intense heat, and the lack of water brought silent deaths. Some collapsed and were left behind on the long transport routes across the plains. Years later, the only remnants of their belongings were found in the dirt, a button, a bent plaque, or a small photo frame whose color had faded over time. In makeshift morgues near the front lines, sometimes the only sign attached to the bodies was a piece of cloth with a faded number. When the morgues were destroyed by artillery fire, identities were destroyed too. Some of them were thus removed from the lists of the dead and listed as missing in action. In the Pacific, some prisoners were transported by small boats for transport. The sea was full of danger, and ships were likely to sink under sudden fire or violent storms. No rescue, no witnesses, only names that were removed from the lists and lost in the silence of the sea. In areas where communication lines were cut, no precise news of the fate of the prisoners was published.
The command only wrote, "Return unknown." Families waiting for news received only a sheet on which was written, "Missing in action." No explanation, no exact time, no specific place. And this was the beginning of a long silence that continued for years. The fate of these prisoners was lost in a fog of ambiguity. No conqueror wept for them. No enemy remembered them. In the books of the war, only a short title remains: "Those who fell into the shadows and never returned home."
During World War II, the seas became one of the most brutal battlefields, where the fate of thousands of sailors and Marines was decided in a matter of minutes, leaving no trace of them. Ships sailed in deep waters, where maps were imprecise and the weather changed at any moment. Sometimes, even without the enemy, nature was enough to swallow an entire unit. Submarines lurked in the darkness of the depths. Suddenly, a torpedo shot would break the silence, and everything would be over in seconds. Fire, smoke, the sound of breaking steel, and then silence. The ship would sink, the sailors on deck abandoned to the cold waves. Those trapped below deck would disappear into the darkness of metal and water. Many would not even have the chance to escape from their compartments. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the routes between North America and Europe became an iron graveyard. Trade convoys traveled with military escorts, but hunters lurked in the depths. When a ship was targeted, the accompanying ships had to continue on their way to protect the other cargoes. It was not always possible to rescue survivors. Storms, extreme cold, and high waves destroyed many in the first hours. Sometimes, the only sign of a ship's demise was a piece of wood or a box that washed up on the shore days later. No letters, no official reports, just one sentence in the operations log. Last call, 0340. Then communication was lost. In the Pacific, remote islands and unknown borders were involved in the battle. Naval aircraft sent out for reconnaissance or support sometimes disappeared after taking off. The sea swallowed them up. Silent, without witnesses, without reports. There were submarines that went on missions with their entire crews and never returned. The radio would go off, and no emergency messages would be received. Sometimes only after the war were wrecks discovered thousands of meters deep by divers or sonar. Inside them, the instruments remained intact, as if time had stood still in those depths. Even giant warships were not immune. In major battles, bombers would descend from the sky and turn the decks into a blazing inferno in a matter of minutes. The ship would sink, taking hundreds or even thousands of people with it. There was not enough time to register. Everyone would go down at the same time. In many cases, sailors who were thrown overboard were left with only simple life jackets on. Cold nights, sharks, thirst, the scorching sun during the day, and finally exhaustion were slowly wearing them down. Days later, only a few empty life jackets were visible on the water. Radio communications sometimes allowed the enemy to locate the ships and open fire on them. For this reason, many ships sailed in radio silence. But this silence also made it impossible to know where they had disappeared. In some operations, planes sent to rescue survivors themselves crashed into the waves. Rescue missions became endless missions, and finally, the command would only order, "End the search." The sea is no witness to testify. The waves carry the past with them, covering up any trace.
Many names were lost in the waters. No grave, no stone, no history. In the ports, families would stare at the waves for hours, in hope that was slowly fading. The answer was just a formal paper, lost at sea. To this day, in some areas, divers sometimes come across the rusted hulls of ships that were destroyed decades ago in the darkness of the depths. Inside them, signs of a short life remain. A helmet on a metal floor, an overturned cup, or a notebook from which nothing remains. Those who disappeared at sea were never heard to breathe their last breath. The war took them to depths where there is nothing but silence. Their fate, like the waters in which they sank, has always remained unknown.
Behind every battle, there was a vast network of supplies. Roads, railways, truck columns, horse-drawn carriages, and soldiers tasked with bringing ammunition and food to the front lines. But these same routes, especially in remote or newly conquered areas, became some of the most dangerous parts of the war, where many soldiers disappeared without a trace. In Eastern Europe, supply routes crossed vast plains. There were no houses, villages, or signs to mark the way. The wind blew sand and dirt off the road, leaving only the tire tracks that disappeared after a few hours. Supply columns moved in the dark of night to avoid enemy aircraft. But in the dark, the slightest mistake could throw a group off the main route. There are reports of convoys sent out to deliver ammunition, but never reaching their destination. Sometimes the only result of the search was a few boxes of ammunition found in the tall grass. There was no sign of the soldiers accompanying them. In some areas, the forests were so dense that visibility was limited to a few meters. If a column got separated, finding its way back was almost impossible. Unmarked mines, enemy ambushes, and endless side roads all provided opportunities for disappearance. In the Italian mountains, behind every battle, there was a vast network of supplies. Roads, railways, truck columns, horse-drawn carriages, and soldiers tasked with bringing ammunition and food to the front lines. But these same routes, especially in remote or newly conquered areas, became some of the most dangerous parts of the war, where many soldiers disappeared without a trace. In Eastern Europe, supply routes crossed vast plains. There were no houses, villages, or signs to mark the way. The wind blew sand and dirt off the road, leaving only the tire tracks that disappeared after a few hours. Supply columns moved in the dark of night to avoid enemy aircraft. But in the dark, the slightest mistake could throw a group off the main route. There are reports of convoys sent out to deliver ammunition, but never reaching their destination. Sometimes the only result of the search was a few boxes of ammunition found in the tall grass. There was no sign of the soldiers accompanying them. In some areas, the forests were so dense that visibility was limited to a few meters. If a column got separated, finding its way back was almost impossible. Unmarked mines, enemy ambushes, and endless side roads all provided opportunities for disappearance. In the Italian mountains, narrow, rocky paths would not allow two vehicles to pass side by side. When it snowed or rained heavily, the roads became slippery and dangerous. Vehicles would fall hundreds of meters down into the valleys. In many cases, there was no possibility of rescue and no opportunity to search. The names of the accompanying soldiers were recorded only on the missing persons list. In Africa, supply convoys traveled across endless deserts. The horizon was dotted with sand dunes, and without a compass or accurate position finder, it was difficult to find their way. Heat, lack of water, sandstorms, and rapid enemy attacks all made groups disappear into silence. Sometimes, the only remaining means of transport was the half-buried body of a truck under the sand. On the Western Front, supply columns often came under artillery fire. In the midst of explosions, drivers were forced to change course. These sudden changes cut off communication with the parent unit. When the attacks subsided and the area was surveyed, in some places, not even a trace of burnt tires or supply boxes could be found. In many operations, soldiers were sent as couriers to deliver messages to other commands. They usually traveled alone, without backup. These missions had the highest rate of disappearances. A wrong turn, an enemy ambush, or even a random shot was enough to never reach their destination. In the Russian winter, supply lines were laid across frozen rivers. Trucks would cross the ice to create a shorter route through the water. But the thickness of the ice was not always reliable. There are reports of entire columns disappearing when an icebreaker broke and took everything to the depths. Soldiers, ammunition, food, all vanished in an instant. Supply trains were not immune either. In many cases, the enemy would target the railway line and the train would derail in the middle of the night, or it was attacked and burned. Bodies were unrecognizable amidst the hot metal and destruction, and the names of the companions were recorded only as disappeared. Sometimes local forces and native people changed their routes or moved signs to confuse the enemy. This led to soldiers being led astray and trapped in unfamiliar territory. Roads that seemed safe became a trap in the dark. Soldiers who walked along the supply lines with hope and duty sometimes simply got lost in the darkness of the night. No sound, no sign. Reports indicate that on some fronts, up to 25% of the missing were from supply units, people who never fought on the front lines but became victims of the same war. Supplies were the bloodline of war, but these same vital routes hid soldiers who never returned home.
World War II was full of rapid and sudden advances, but behind those advances were retreats that often resulted in chaos, loss, and disappearance of hundreds of soldiers. Whenever a defensive line collapsed, communications were cut, and units were left without a leader in unfamiliar terrain. Many, however, were completely erased from the pages of history. On the Eastern Front, the harsh Russian winter turned any retreat into a complete disaster. Many soldiers in Donbass, Leningrad, and Kharkov were caught in a cold that claimed their lives in a matter of hours. There are reports of groups that, after retreating, got lost in a snowstorm and never found again. No weapons, no equipment, no bodies, only snowy sediment that seemed to have swallowed everything. At the Battle of Kursk, units tasked with a smooth and orderly retreat actually got lost in the wheat fields due to radio interference. Some were later discovered, but often only the tracks of tanks could be seen, obliterated by wind and rain. In North Africa, the retreat from the Libyan desert towards Tunisia repeatedly caused soldiers to disappear. The merciless desert left no trace except mounds of dirt at the soldiers' feet. After the retreats, some clearings revealed only tent pegs and empty flasks. No human traces remained, as if the desert had swallowed everything. In Greece and Crete, the hasty abandonment of positions forced troops to traverse mountainous paths, roads that enemy planes chased during the day, and at night, darkness and fog made it impossible to see. Soldiers who strayed from the path had no contact with either their own troops or the local population. They often disappeared silently, with the only sign of them being a brief missing report. In the Philippines, the retreat from Bataan into the jungles caused hundreds of soldiers to disappear. The intense humidity, wild animals, and poisonous plants made the return journey difficult. Some of the wounded, unable to move, were abandoned in the vast tropical foliage and never heard from again. Nature silently devoured and war was the only storyteller to tell a story that no one had an ending to. In France, when Paris fell, the hustle and bustle of the roads filled with refugees and soldiers caused some units to lose their way. Some were captured, and others disappeared altogether. Reports state that some groups were last seen in the northern forests, but no sign of them has been found since. In land retreats, vehicles were often abandoned, roads were under enemy fire or crowded. Foot soldiers with heavy equipment were likely to encounter the enemy or lack supplies. Sometimes, a hail of bullets would cause a group to flee from the main route, a flight that would take many into the unknown heart of the jungle, where there was no way back. On rural battlefields, abandoned houses became shelters, but these shelters were not always safe. There are scattered reports of units taking refuge in abandoned houses and then never being seen again, without fighting or the sound of gunfire. It was as if the house held the dead. In many retreats, commanders were forced to make difficult decisions. Sometimes, wounded soldiers were left behind in the hope that they would return later and find them. But often, either the enemy arrived early or the weather made the return journey impossible. These individuals, without witnesses and without documents, were added to a long list of missing. In some cases, military archives recount that groups of soldiers were sent out in the dark of night to access the bypass, but never returned to their units by the end of the war. Searches were fruitless, and months later, only a few small personal effects were found among the foliage. In chaotic retreats, nothing was predictable. Enemy fire, communication cuts, loss of command and control, all created conditions in which disappearances were not the exception, but an inevitable part of war. Many of these missing men were recognized in post-war memoirs as unsung heroes, people who did not leave the square, but the square plunged them into eternal silence.
In World War II, amid the bloody lands of Europe and Asia, there was another front, where neither a cry could be heard nor a trace of battle remained: the sea. The cold waters of the oceans swallowed up thousands of soldiers, sailors, and submariners into an endless silence and hid them from the world forever. The Battle of the Atlantic is one of the longest and most brutal naval battles in history. Ships carrying supplies from North America to Europe wandered through waves and thick fog. German submarines lay in wait. Often, a single torpedo was enough to sink a huge ship with hundreds of people into the water in a matter of minutes. In many cases, there was no time to send an emergency message. The ship would disappear, and with it, hundreds of destinies would disappear. In the few surviving reports, there are names recorded only as disappeared at sea. No graves, no remains, no memorials of them remain. Submarines themselves are some of the world's most mysterious tombs. Many of them lay in the dark depths with no word of their fate. No one knows how their final moments inside that cold steel were spent. Did the crew have time to understand? Did they silently sink under relentless pressure? Or did a sudden explosion end them? In the Pacific, the battleships and destroyers faced the constant threat of kamikaze planes and deadly submarines amongst the scattered tropical islands. In many battles, the remains of the ships were never found. There were islands that reported the crash of a plane or ship, but no message from survivors and no trace of bodies. Only bits of rubber or wood were occasionally seen on the shore, a small reminder of the drowned who were no more. In the North Sea, huge storms swallowed up ships like light leaves. Even before the enemy arrived, resisting the wrath of nature was a real fight for survival. When a ship disappeared among the waves, it was often impossible to search for it. The cold weather, the waves of tens of meters, and the endless storms all prevented anyone from knowing the truth about the fate of the crew. The crews of planes flying over the sea were also in constant danger. With a technical malfunction or an enemy bullet, the plane would crash into the sea and the waves would drag it down in a split second. In many cases, there was not even a chance to see the parachute. In coastal battles, the small amphibious boats that carried soldiers to the shore were the target of enemy artillery fire. Many of them sank before reaching the shore. Many soldiers, carrying armor and ammunition, could not swim and did die in the shallow waters near the shore. Their bodies were found years later on remote beaches or never seen. Many ships sink at greater depths that are difficult or impossible to find themselves. Such depths do not allow any recovery or rescue. Those cold steels slowly became a part of history on the seabed, a history that rules the waters in silence. Death at sea is silent. Neither a bullet is heard nor a loud cry. Water covers everything and buries the stories of the heroes who stepped into the heart of the oceans forever in darkness.
In the heart of the battlefield, where fire and smoke split the sky and shook the earth, there were soldiers whose names remained in the reports, nor did their fates appear in the memories of their families. They stood firm amidst the dust and rubble, but in the end, only one cold word took their place in the files: missing. No one knew what happened to them after their last day on the front line. Were they buried under the rubble of trenches? Were they drowned in the swamps? Or disappeared in the midst of a sudden attack? Some soldiers were separated from the main column in the chaos of the turning battles and were captured by darkness and uncharted terrain that changed its nature from moment to moment. In the Battle of Stalingrad, where the city was reduced to 1,000 war rooms, soldiers took refuge in ruined buildings, structures that would be reduced to piles of rubble within minutes of being hit by artillery. There are accounts of people who entered factories, basements, or steam tunnels and were never seen again. Perhaps by the rubble, perhaps by the smoke and poison, perhaps by the enemy who came silently and took lives in the darkness. The only clear fact was that they never returned. On the French front, the dense forests of Ardennes had become a living labyrinth. Units on reconnaissance missions would penetrate deep into the forest, sometimes disappearing into the leaves and fog without a shot or a shout being heard. After the war, when the locals entered the jungle, among the moss and rotting tree trunks, sometimes only a helmet or a rusty plaque would be visible, a sign of a soldier who had perhaps paused for a moment and then perished. The same fate was repeated in the deserts of North Africa. The wind ruthlessly erased the tracks, and the shifting sands buried the missing men forever. There are accounts of soldiers who set out alone to find water or to reach their unit and became lost in the sand. Months later, other groups would sometimes come across skulls or worn-out clothing that had no identity. On the islands of the Pacific, the rainforests, with their endless shadows and heavy silence, witnessed the disappearance of entire groups. Paths were hidden under the roots of trees, and torrential rains turned the ground into pits of death. Sometimes the only sound was the rustling of leaves, perhaps an animal, perhaps an enemy approaching silently. Many of these soldiers died under the foliage, and in that humid climate, their bodies decomposed so quickly that when the search began, not even a trace of them remained. Planes flying to deliver ammunition or aid crashed in thick fog or sudden rains. Some carcasses were found years later, but the crews never were. The forest swallowed everything. On the European trench lines, it often happened that the hail of bullets forced soldiers to take refuge in basements or tunnels among the ruined trenches. Many of these makeshift shelters collapsed after being hit by mortars, and anyone inside was buried instantly. The dirt quickly flowed over the bodies, and over time, not even a trace of the burial site remained. Later, when the areas were cleared, sometimes only a small mound of earth remained, the silent remains of those who had rested in the depths of the earth.
In some places, the tides would wash the bodies out to sea, never to be found again.
In the heart of the battlefields, where fire and smoke split the sky and shook the earth, there were soldiers whose names remained in the reports, nor did their fates appear in the memories of their families. They stood firm amidst the dust and rubble, but in the end, only one cold word took their place in the files: missing. No one knew what happened to them after their last day on the front line. Were they buried under the rubble of trenches? Were they drowned in the swamps? Or disappeared in the midst of a sudden attack? Some soldiers were separated from the main column in the chaos of the turning battles and were captured by darkness and uncharted terrain that changed its nature from moment to moment. In the Battle of Stalingrad, where the city was reduced to 1,000 war rooms, soldiers took refuge in ruined buildings, structures that would be reduced to piles of rubble within minutes of being hit by artillery. There are accounts of people who entered factories, basements, or steam tunnels and were never seen again, perhaps by the rubble, perhaps by the smoke and poison, perhaps by the enemy who came silently and took lives in the darkness. The only clear fact was that they never returned. On the French front, the dense forests of Ardennes had become a living labyrinth. Units on reconnaissance missions would penetrate deep into the forest, sometimes disappearing into the leaves and fog without a shot or a shout being heard. After the war, when the locals entered the jungle, among the moss and rotting tree trunks, sometimes only a helmet or a rusty plaque would be visible, a sign of a soldier who had perhaps paused for a moment and then perished. The same fate was repeated in the deserts of North Africa. The wind ruthlessly erased the tracks, and the shifting sands buried the missing men forever. There are accounts of soldiers who set out alone to find water or to reach their unit and became lost in the sand. Months later, other groups would sometimes come across skulls or worn-out clothing that had no identity. On the islands of the Pacific, the rainforests, with their endless shadows and heavy silence, witnessed the disappearance of entire groups. Paths were hidden under the roots of trees, and torrential rains turned the ground into pits of death. Sometimes, the only sound was the rustling of leaves, perhaps an animal, perhaps an enemy approaching silently. Many of these soldiers died under the foliage, and in that humid climate, their bodies decomposed so quickly that when the search began, not even a trace of them remained. Planes flying to deliver ammunition or aid crashed in thick fog or sudden rains. Some carcasses were found years later, but the crews never were. The forest swallowed everything. On the European trench lines, it often happened that the hail of bullets forced soldiers to take refuge in basements or tunnels among the ruined trenches. Many of these makeshift shelters collapsed after being hit by mortars, and anyone inside was buried instantly. The dirt quickly flowed over the bodies, and over time, not even a trace of the burial site remained. Later, when the areas were cleared, sometimes only a small mound of earth remained, the silent remains of those who had rested in the depths of the earth. In some places, the tides would wash the bodies out to sea, never to be found again. By the end of the days when the front line was moving, most of the soldiers who had been assigned to points further away from the main lines were completely cut off from the central structure. Some were forced to retreat under enemy fire and were lost in the cold, unmarked plains or mountains. Their fate was sealed in a deadly silence, a silence that had no witnesses or precise history. A few were ambushed, without anyone knowing of their brief battle, and some died of cold or hunger, with no one there to bury them. Those who fought on the front lines alongside their comrades sometimes vanished in an instant. The explosion that threw dust into the air would crush a soldier's body beyond recognition. Amid the sound of mortar fire and screams, soldiers could only see a few steps ahead, and if one suddenly collapsed and was buried under the rubble, no one could stand to help. The battle raged on, and death, in a short distance, claimed silent victims. Many of these people were never recorded later, neither as killed nor captured. They remained nameless, and only the dirt of the battlefield bore witness to their existence. In some rural parts of Europe, local people told stories after the war had ended. Vague stories of units that had passed through fields at night and gone into the woods, but never returned. Sometimes months later, people would find objects among the roots of trees or by streams, a rusty flask, a helmet with a hole in it, or a notebook with a soldier's name written on it. These relics were the only signs of lives that had ended in silence. Amidst these stories, a bitter truth emerges. War does not only take those who are killed, it also erases some from the pages of time. The men who fought to the last moment found neither names nor graves. They disappeared on the border between presence and absence, where history cannot answer and the earth keeps its secret. These lost soldiers were neither silent losers nor heroes crowned by fate. They were part of the silent price of war, lives that were given without leaving any memory, except for the bitter truth that still resonates in the heart of the battlefields. In war, silence is sometimes louder than any scream.